we hear about a warm and fuzzy Jesus. Or so we think. We hear about Jesus who calls a little child over and puts him in his arms and embraces him. What a loving, lovely thought. And it is very much a part of why we think in those terms, because we really treasure our small children. We love them. We protect them. We seek to guide them and teach them and raise them up. But it was not that way in the time of Jesus. Jesus is using the child in a way to teach a larger truth here. And that truth has to do with what he just said beforehand. But then why and how is he using this child in this way? Well, to understand how this is all very different and how we are different from the people in the gospel story, and where the words land differently for us, is because children in the time of Jesus often died in infancy. The mortality rate for children in that day and age was extremely high. And in fact, mortality also impacted the mothers. Women frequently died in the process of childbirth. And very often, both the mother and the child would die. And so our more romantic vision of children and families was not the vision of the people in Palestine at the time that Jesus lived and walked and talked among us. In fact, children were sort of ignored until they were old enough to be of some economic benefit. They were economic commodities in a way. Well, I'm not saying that parents didn't care for their children. No, but often the socialization was such that when a child was born, you didn't really get close to the child because you weren't so sure the child would be there for very long. And the heartbreak that is just hardwired into us when a child so young passes away, which was more frequent than we want to think about, would have been hard. And so, in a way, the culture of the time sort of inured itself to that pain and that grief, which would be a very natural kind of response, by holding children at a distance and not getting too close to them until you were sure they're going to be around for a while. Children, as I mentioned, were an economic reality because in the time of Jesus, having a large family was of great benefit, particularly if you were a farmer. And so in a very real way, from the early days of God's people, the laws of Moses, all of that was built around, we have a tendency to romanticize the family. Father, mother, children, all of that. But our images come from probably more the 19th century than they did the 1st century or the centuries before Jesus. Because until then, it was too hard to see a child die, and even too hard to see the mother pass in the process of bringing children. So in a very real way, to kind of objectify it a little bit, I might be a tad crass in saying this, but families were not the closely knit things we think of them today. They were baby farms. You got married so that you could bear children. And it is not unusual then to see ancient cultures, including the Hebrew people in the most ancient of days, to be polygamists, to have several wives, because it was the duty of the wife to bring forth the life of a baby so that the family could grow, so that there would be economic security. And it was the dad's role to make the baby and rule the roost, as it were. That's just a fact. It's the way it was. I'm not saying anything about it except for that reality. Because that's what would have colored the mindset of the people of Jesus' time as Jesus was teaching there in Capernaum. So for him to take a child into his arms isn't simply that warm and fuzzy look that we love to quote and etch into our school cornerstone, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." You know, that's all well and good, and it is true. But it's true for a very different reason, because you see, children, as I mentioned, were kind of pushed to the edge. They were one more bit of the population that was pushed to the margin, because they were seen primarily as servants in the family system. In fact, if you go back and you look at the language that is used in the Old Testament, the word that is used for child often is pais. In English, we would say P-A-I-S, pais. If you also look at different translations in the Scriptures, in the New Testament, you will see the same word in a different context translated servant. The same word. And so it becomes a little more clear that children, once they got to a certain age, as soon as they were able to perform certain tasks, they were expected to do that. Of course, most of us in this room probably had chores growing up. Well, it was a very different kind of thing there. It was more than simply a thing or two that you did to learn a skill or to support the family as needed. This was an integral part of the economy of Jesus' day. To get a clearer idea of the attitude, I'd maybe point your vision toward a series on television, a period drama that many of you probably know, Downton Abbey. How many of you are Downton Abbey fans? Or any of those period dramas from that era, when they still had the large families and batteries of servants. The child's role was that probably most parallel to that of the footman. Now, if you go back and you dial up your Downton Abbey memories, the footmen were the people who basically opened the doors, closed the doors, cleaned this, did that, stood around and watched everyone else eat until they were called upon to bring the next course, or if they were summoned to the table to bring something for one of the principals that was around the table. They were essentially there. They were human beings, to be sure, and they were treated as human beings, but they were not treated as part of the family itself, the core entity here, because they listened to every word that was being spoken around the table. They heard all of the intimate conversations in the household, but they dare not breathe a word about it to anyone else. They were essentially part of the furniture. That's the way children were seen in the time of Jesus. Maybe some of us are old enough to have had parents or elders who said, children are to be seen and not heard. That's what we're talking about. Not the romantic vision of children we have now. Not the helicopter parents' way of doing things. No. It was very different than our experience. So when Jesus calls the child over, it would be like he was taking the footman and saying, you, to be my disciples, this is what you must become. That's why the words of Jesus just prior to that action are about the first being last. And in order to understand the ways of the kingdom of God, you had to become a servant of all. That's what Jesus is doing. It's an object lesson that Jesus is accomplishing here. It's not anything to do with the special place of children in our life. I don't deny that. I think that's a very important thing for us to do, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here. What Jesus is talking about here is that you must be the servant. As this child serves you, must you serve each other. That is the beginning of the kind of love that I am trying to teach you. Now, the Apostle James heard that, obviously, because as he's writing his letter, that's exactly what he's talking about. He's saying that if you have selfish ambition at the core of your being, if all you're worried about is getting more and getting bigger, having more power and more money and more influence, then you will miss the boat. You will miss the coming of the kingdom of God. Because the kingdom of God is about becoming as this little child. The kingdom of God is about becoming the footman. The kingdom of God is about becoming the servant of all, because that's the beginning of love. Because the love that Jesus shows to us, to you, to me, to those first disciples, and every disciple ever since, in that Greek word that I have so often exposed to you, is agape. There are many words for love in Greek, but that's the one Jesus most frequently uses. And when he, at that Last Supper, when he waits on his own disciples by washing their feet, he teaches them, you must learn to love one another as I have loved you. And to the very end, he's trying to show them that that love is worked out in selfless service to one another. That love is not about good feelings. That love isn't about warm fuzzies. That love is about doing the hard work of caring for one another, of being there for one another, of doing and taking care of the people who are the least in society to make sure that they come first. That's the mystery. That's the core. And that's what St. James is talking about in his letter. It's this same letter that we have heard that your faith without your works is dead. That's why. Because unless you become like the servant, like the child, then you are not loving. You are being selfish and self-centered. And the love that I show to you is exactly the opposite. So Jesus, by this action, does a radical thing. He does yet another time, does something that turns the accepted order on its head. Yes, the children should be loved because they are valuable in and of themselves. They are children of God as you and I are, absolutely, to be sure. But first, we must be servants. Servants of one another. And as Christ gave his life not just for those who love him, but for all, so too we must be servants of the world. Not doing what the world wants. That's exactly what St. James is saying we don't do. But rather by becoming like this pais, this child, this servant, we will do what Jesus did. And we will be able to school ourselves into that sense of love that is the very heart, the very core of the gospel. So we need to step back for a moment and just think. Is that the primary motivation of my life? to be of service. It can be in small ways or large ways. We are all given different gifts, and we are all called to do different things. But that ultimately, that is who we must become. Because that is the very presence of Jesus. He's not telling us to be childish, not even childlike, but to be a servant. A servant whole. A servant who gives of oneself so completely that, like Jesus, in the end, the highest measure of service is to give up one's life. Would it be so for us? What a loving and wonderful community we would have, not only in this building, among the people who gather here and share this table, but the world that seeks that so dearly. We are a light for them. For that is who Jesus was. That is who we